3 identical faces, 3 impossible men. One night that was never supposed to happen, and a young woman who walked into their world carrying a mop and a resume and absolutely no idea that she was about to become the single point around which 3 of the most feared men in Korea would quietly, completely, and irreversibly rearrange their entire lives.
I'm almost there.
Nadia Bello did not believe in destiny.
Incredible.
She believed in rent, in her mother's medical bills, and in showing up on time. But destiny, it turned out, believed in her. Welcome to Story World Besties. Please like, share, and subscribe. The Kang estate sat in the hills above Seoul like a secret the city was keeping from itself. 12 rooms, 2 wings, a garden that had not been tended in over a year. And 3 men who lived inside it with the specific energy of people who had made peace with the idea that warmth was something that happened to other people. Kang Min-ho, Kang Seo-jun, and Kang Ji-woo were 32 years old and shared everything except temperament. Min-ho was the eldest by 4 minutes and ran the organization with the precision of a surgeon and the coldness of one, too. Seo-jun was the middle-born and the one people feared most in a room, not because he was loudest, but because he was the quietest, and that particular silence had a specific grammar that men in their world had learned to read correctly. Ji-woo was last, and had spent his entire life being underestimated because of it, and had long since turned that underestimation into the sharpest weapon in the room. The 3 of them together were what people in Seoul's underworld called the North Star, fixed, unreachable, and the point by which everything else oriented itself. They did not bring women into the estate. They did not keep staff longer than 3 months. They had rules about attachment the way other men had rules about money, rigidly and without exception, because attachment was a liability, and in their world, liabilities got people killed. The housekeeper agency sent Nadia Bello on a Tuesday morning in October, and she arrived at the estate gate with a tote bag, a professional reference from her previous employer, and absolutely zero knowledge of who she was going to be working for. The gate guard looked at her for a long time. She looked back at him with the particular patience of someone who had spent years being scrutinized and had decided that the most powerful response was stillness. He made a call. A minute passed. He let her through. The house was beautiful and cold. Not temperature cold, though it was that too, but cold the way a room is cold when it has not been lived in properly, when the people inside it have been present without being there. Nadia walked through the entrance hall and noted the dust along the upper edge of the wainscoting, the overflowing mail tray by the east corridor door, the kitchen with its perfectly stocked refrigerator, and its single-used coffee cup sitting in the center of the counter like a sculpture of loneliness. She set her bag down and got to work. She had been cleaning for 3 hours when the first one came home. Min-ho walked in through the side entrance at 2 in the afternoon with his jacket folded over one arm and his phone at his ear and the expression of a man who had not expected to find someone in his kitchen. He stopped. His eyes moved over her with the swift assessment he applied to everything, taking inventory, cataloging, filing. She was crouched near the lower cabinet with a cloth in one hand and a spray bottle in the other, and she looked up at him without flinching, which was, he would think about later, the first remarkable thing. Most people flinched, not dramatically, just slightly, the small bodily admission that they understood the hierarchy of the room they were standing in. She did not flinch. She looked at him with dark, level eyes and said in clear and unaccented Korean that she was from the agency and that she had found a significant mold situation behind the lower cabinet that she wanted to flag before she addressed it. He stared at her for 2 full seconds. Then he told the person on the phone he would call them back, hung up, and asked her to show him. She showed him. He crouched beside her in his expensive suit and looked at the mold behind the cabinet and said, with a flatness that had no place in the sentence, that it had been there since last winter. She told him she could address it that afternoon if he had the proper cleaning materials, or she could source them. He said he would have his assistant send a list to the agency. She said she would handle it directly, and that agency intermediaries for supply requests added 48 hours to resolution timelines. He looked at her again. He said, "Fine." She went back to cleaning. He left the kitchen and stood in the hallway for a moment looking at nothing, and something moved in his chest that he did not name because he had spent years not naming things and was very good at it. That evening, all three of them were home for the first time in what felt like months. Jiwoo found her in the library, reorganizing the books that had been shelved by whoever last touched them with no apparent system, and watched her from the doorway for longer than was strictly necessary before she noticed him and turned. He did not look embarrassed. He leaned against the frame and asked what system she was using. She said chronological by acquisition date where she could determine it, thematic otherwise. He blinked. He asked how she was determining acquisition date. She pointed to the faint pencil notations on the inside covers, dates written in a hand she had identified across 12 books as belonging to the same person. He looked at the books. He looked at her. He said that was his grandfather's notation system. She said she had figured that. He did not say anything else, but he stayed in the doorway for another 3 minutes in silence, which was, she would understand later, Jiwoo's version of a conversation. Seo Jun was the last. She did not see him so much as become aware of him, the way you become aware of a change in pressure. She was in the upstairs corridor at 9 in the evening, having worked a 12-hour day with 30 minutes for lunch, and she felt something shift in the air behind her and turned to find him standing at the far end of the hall, watching her with an expression that was completely unreadable and completely focused. She did not know then that Seo Jun's unreadable expression was the one he only wore when something had genuinely caught his attention, because most things had not genuinely caught his attention in a very long time. She said good evening. He said nothing. She went back to work. He stood there for another 10 seconds and then walked into his room and closed the door and stood on the other side of it staring at the wall. Nadia did not know any of this. She finished her shift, collected her bag, took the transit back to the small apartment she shared with her younger cousin, called her mother in Lagos for 20 minutes, and went to sleep thinking about the mold situation and whether the agency would actually approve the supply budget she needed. A week passed. She came every day. The estate began to change in small, visible ways. The dust receded. The garden, which she had no brief for but could not ignore, began to look like something living again. The kitchen, already stocked by whoever managed their supplies, became a place where meals happened rather than a room adjacent to a life. She cooked once, on the third day, because there was food that would expire, and it seemed wasteful not to, and left it covered on the counter before she left. She did not mention it. The next morning the container was empty and washed and returned to the cabinet. She cooked again the next day, and the next. None of them said anything about the food. But she noticed that it disappeared faster on the days she made her mother's recipes, the jollof that she'd adapted for the pantry available, the pepper soup she made from whatever came close enough, the fried plantains on the Friday because plantains had appeared in the produce delivery and she could not in good conscience let them go unused. On the Friday, Jiwoo came into the kitchen while she was frying and stood near the counter with his arms crossed and his chin slightly lifted and said after a long pause that it smelled like something. She said it was West African. He said he had not had West African food before. She said that was unfortunate. He almost smiled. Almost. By the end of the second week, she knew the rhythms of the house. Minho left earliest and came back latest and ate standing at the counter in the kitchen, always as if sitting down to eat was a luxury he had decided he did not have time for. Seo Jun moved through the estate like a frequency she could feel before she heard him, his presence arriving before his footsteps did, and he had a habit of appearing in whatever room she was in and saying nothing and leaving 20 minutes later having said nothing, as if her presence was itself a sufficient reason to be somewhere. Jiwoo, she decided, was the one who wanted to talk the most and had the least practice at it, and so instead he asked questions about practical things, the cleaning supplies, the garden, the books, the food, and underneath all the practical questions was something that was not practical at all. She told herself she was imagining it. She was very good at being practical, and she was very good at not seeing things that would complicate her life. She needed this job. The pay was exceptional by any standard, the estate supplied everything, and the brothers did not give her grief or make her feel small or talk to her the way some employers talk to staff. They talked to her as if she was a person in the room, which, in her experience, was not as common as it should be. She was not going to complicate that by noticing the way Minho's jaw shifted when she disagreed with him, or the way Seo-jun stood closer than necessary when she was explaining something, or the way Jiwoo had started saving the interesting books from the shelves and leaving them on the kitchen counter where she would find them in the mornings. She was not going to notice any of that. On the third week, someone from outside the estate took notice of her. His name was Park Dae-yeon, and he was one of the 3 men who regularly met with the brothers at the estate, a kind of intermediary whose specific role in their organization she had learned not to ask about. He was handsome in the obvious way, and he knew it, and he had the particular confidence of a man who had never been told no in any context he considered important. He came to the estate on a Wednesday and found Nadia in the garden and spent 10 minutes talking to her in a way that was outwardly friendly and inwardly something else entirely. She was polite. She was not interested. She kept working. He kept talking. She did not see Minho appear at the upper window of the east wing. She did not see the stillness that came over his face when he looked down at the scene in the garden. She did not see him turn from the window and walk to the door with a pace that was not hurried, but was very precise, and she did not hear whatever he said to Dae-yeon when he appeared in the garden 60 seconds later because whatever it was said very quietly, and Dae-yeon left the estate shortly after. She noticed that Dae-yeon was gone. She assumed it was because the meeting had ended. She went back to weeding. Minho stood in the kitchen doorway that evening and watched her rinse her hands at the sink and told her, with a casualness that cost him something to produce, that if anyone made her uncomfortable, she should tell him directly. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the counter. She said she would. He nodded and left. She stood at the sink for a moment with the water still running and told herself, very firmly, that it meant nothing. 3 days later, Seo-jun was in the kitchen when she arrived in the morning, which was unusual. He was already dressed, which was not unusual, but he was sitting at the counter with a cup of coffee and no phone and no documents and nothing to indicate a reason for being in the kitchen at 7 in the morning other than being in the kitchen at 7 in the morning. She said good morning. He said good morning. She started the day's work. He stayed at the counter. After 20 minutes, she asked if there was something he needed. He said no. She said, was there something she could help with? He said no. She looked at him. He looked at his coffee. She went back to work. After another 10 minutes, he asked, without looking up, whether she had ever considered that 12-hour days were not sustainable. She said she was contracted for 8 and the other 4 were her own choice and he could raise his concerns with the agency. He looked up then. His expression was still unreadable, but it had shifted somewhere underneath. A tectonic thing, small and invisible and total. He said he was not raising a concern with the agency. He was saying it to her. She asked why. He said because she was the one working 12 hours. She looked at him for a moment, and then said that was the most words she had heard him say at one time since she started working there. He looked back at his coffee. Something moved at the corner of his mouth. Not a smile. The shape a smile would leave behind if a smile had been there. She did not tell herself it meant nothing that time. She just didn't say anything about what it meant. The danger arrived on a Thursday. It arrived in the form of 3 men at the estate gate who were not scheduled and were not the kind of men who made appointments. The gate guard handled it, but not before one of them made it past the perimeter and came through the east garden, and Nadia, who was in the garden at the time and did not know that this was a threat and not a maintenance contractor, stood up from behind the rose border and found herself 3 feet from a man who was not there for maintenance. He looked at her. She looked at him. She was very still, the way she was always still. But this stillness was different. The particular stillness of someone whose body has registered danger before the mind has finished processing it. What happened next happened fast. Seo-jun came through the garden door at a pace that was not his usual pace, and his usual pace already communicated something, but this one communicated something else entirely, and the man who had come through the perimeter took one look at him and made a decision about the value of continuing his current course of action, and found that value to be negative. He retreated. The situation was resolved in under 2 minutes with no violence and no words that Nadia could hear clearly. But when Seo-jun came back across the garden to where she was still standing with her garden gloves on and her expression very controlled, he stopped close enough that she could see the specific quality of the tension in his jaw, and he looked at her face for a long time without speaking, and then he said, "Are you all right?" It was not the words. It was the register they arrived in, the stripped, direct register of a question being asked by someone who is asking it from somewhere real and raw and has not had time to put the professional distance back on. She said she was fine. He looked at her for another second, and then he said he should not have been in that garden, and she should not have been alone out there. She said she had not known. He said he knew, and something in his voice said that was exactly what was wrong with it. He was angry, she understood, but not at her. He was angry at the circumstance and at whoever had created it and at himself for not preventing it. She said she really was fine. He exhaled slowly. He said she should come inside. She came inside. He walked beside her and not behind her, which she noticed, the specific choice of that position. Close enough to be between her and anything that might come from any direction. Minho was in the main corridor when they came back into the house, and he looked at Nadia, and then at Seo-jun, and then at Nadia again. And something moved between the brothers that was wordless and complete, and she did not understand all of it, but she understood enough to know that the incident outside had landed on them harder than it had landed on her. Ji-woo appeared from the study doorway and looked at her with an expression that was, for Ji-woo, utterly transparent, worry, unmistakable and undisguised, and he asked twice if she was all right before Minho put a hand briefly on his shoulder and he stopped asking. That night she heard them through the wall. Not the words, just the tone. 3 voices in the study, 2 of them elevated. One of them very quiet in the specific way that Seo-jun was quiet when he was at his most dangerous. She lay on the cot in the staff room they had insisted she use on late nights rather than take transit at midnight. And she stared at the ceiling and thought about 3 men who had rearranged themselves completely in less than a second to put themselves between her and a stranger in a garden. And she thought about what that meant. And she decided that she would think about what it meant in the morning when she was less tired and more capable of making good decisions. In the morning, she did not think about it. She got up and made breakfast for 4. All 3 of them came to the kitchen at the same time for the first time, which had never happened before. They sat at the counter in a row and ate the food she made and said nothing in a way that was not uncomfortable but was very full, somehow, the kind of silence that has been built on top of a lot of things and is holding them. She poured coffee for each of them, and when she poured Minho's, he looked at her hand and then up at her face and said, in a voice that was meant to be ordinary and was not quite, that she did not have to stay late tonight. She said her shift ran until 8. He said her shift could run until 5 if she wanted it to. She looked at him. He looked at his coffee. She said she would think about it. She stayed until 8. The 4th week brought a change in the temperature of the estate that Nadia could feel but could not have articulated precisely. It was in the small things. The way the staff room had been quietly upgraded, a better mattress, a lamp with a warmer bulb, a shelf that had appeared with 3 novels on it, all in English, all the kind she had mentioned in a passing conversation with Ji-woo that she liked. The way her preferred coffee was now in the kitchen cabinet specifically, a brand she had mentioned once to Minho in the context of a supply order she was recommending. The way Seo-jun had, without announcement, begun leaving the house in the morning at a time that coincided with her arrival and walking her from the gate to the main entrance, not saying this was what he was doing, simply appearing at the gate at 7:15 every morning with his coat on and his phone in his pocket and falling into step beside her. She noticed all of it. She did not say anything about any of it because she did not know what to say, and because the saying of it would make it real in a way that would require her to respond to it, and she was not ready for that. What she was ready for was the argument on the Thursday of the 4th week, which she had not planned, and which arrived with the particular abruptness of things that have been building for too long in too small a space. It started because Minho had scheduled a meeting at the estate for that evening, a meeting that involved people she did not know, and a level of security preparation that required her to stay in the staff wing for the duration. And he had informed her of this at 4 in the afternoon, which meant she had rearranged her evening and was now waiting in the staff room at 9 o'clock with nothing to do and a growing sense of frustration at being managed without being consulted. When the meeting ended and she heard the guests leave, she came out and found Minho in the kitchen alone and told him that 4 hours' notice for a full evening restriction was not acceptable, and that if this was going to be a regular occurrence, she needed to know in advance so she could plan accordingly. He stared at her. She held his gaze and said she was not asking for special treatment. She was asking for the same courtesy that any employer owed any employee, which was basic information about what was happening in her workplace. He said the meeting had been arranged last minute. She said that was his scheduling problem and she was not his emergency solution. His jaw tightened. She did not back down. He said she was being unreasonable. She said he was confusing unreasonable with inconvenient, and those were not the same thing. The silence afterward was different from the other silences in the estate. It was taut and charged and very alive. Minho looked at her with an expression she had not seen on him before, something that lived below the coldness he usually wore, something that was being pressed up against the surface of it by the pressure of the last 4 weeks and this moment, and her standing in his kitchen refusing to be small. He said, in a voice that was very controlled and very deliberate, that she was the most stubborn person he had ever employed. She said she had been called worse. He said he did not doubt it. They looked at each other. Something shifted in the room, the particular shift that happens when two people stop talking about the thing they are arguing about and start talking about the thing they are actually arguing about, which was not the meeting schedule, and they both knew it. She left the kitchen first. She went to the staff room and sat on the edge of the new mattress and pressed her hands flat on her thighs and breathed. Her heart was doing something she did not appreciate. She told it to stop. It did not stop. Minho stood in the kitchen alone for 3 minutes and then went and found Seo-jun and Ji-woo and told them, in the terse shorthand of 3 people who had been speaking to each other without speaking for their entire lives, that they had a problem. Seo-jun looked at him. Ji-woo looked at the table. Neither of them asked what problem. They already knew. The next morning she arrived at 7:15 and Seo-jun was at the gate as he always was, which she had expected. What she had not expected was Minho beside him, or Ji-woo a step behind, all 3 of them, at 7:15 in the morning, standing at the gate in various states of having dressed in a hurry, which for men who normally dressed as though they had been born wearing good suits was notable. She stopped walking when she saw them. They looked at her. She looked at them. The morning was cold and clear, and the light was coming in low and gold over the estate walls and catching on all 3 of them in a way that was frankly unfair. Minho spoke first. He said he owed her an apology for the previous evening. His voice had the particular quality of a person who had spent several hours deciding to say something and was now saying it at the cost of something it was costing him. She said nothing. He said 4 hours' notice was not reasonable and it would not happen again. She said she accepted the apology. Seo-jun said nothing. Ji-woo said from slightly behind and to the left that there was also a scheduling conflict on the 23rd he wanted to flag before it became an issue. She looked at Ji-woo. He had his hands in his pockets and an expression of total innocence that was entirely manufactured. She almost smiled. Almost. She said she could look at the calendar that morning. He said that would be helpful. They went inside, but something had changed at the gate. Something had cracked open very slightly, enough to let a little light through, and none of them were going to talk about it. But they were all going to live inside it now, and it was going to get warmer. The crisis arrived at the end of the 4th week, which in retrospect seemed almost designed, as if the universe had decided that things had been building long enough and it was time to accelerate them. A rival organization had been watching the Kang estate for longer than the brothers had known. They had identified a pattern that the brothers' own people had missed because they had been looking outward and the vulnerability was internal. It was the fact that their housekeeper arrived and departed on a consistent schedule, on foot, through a regular transit route, and that this housekeeper had become in 4 short weeks. Something that the 3 of them could not be moved from the way men could be moved from assets and territory and money, because she was not an asset, and she had become irreplaceable in a way that had nothing to do with logistics. She was taken on a Tuesday, not dramatically, not with violence at the outset. It looked at first like a transit delay, a car beside the stop, a conversation she was pulled into before she understood what it was, and then the door and the darkness and the understanding arriving fully and finally that this was exactly the thing Seo-jun had put himself between her and in the garden 3 weeks ago, and this time there had been no one between her and it. Minho's phone rang at 8:27 in the morning when she had not arrived, and Seo-jun had already been standing at the gate for 12 minutes. It was not her. It was the person who had her. What followed was not something Nadia witnessed from the inside. She sat in a room with a locked door and a single window with bars, and she breathed and she counted and she thought about her mother and her cousin and the estate kitchen and the books on the shelf in the staff room, and she did not allow herself to be afraid in any way that was not useful. She allowed the fear that was useful, the kind that sharpened attention and identified exits and measured sounds and cataloged the distance between the voices outside the door and the location of the window. She did not allow the kind that paralyzed. What she did not know was what was happening on the other side of that locked door. What was happening was this: 3 men who had spent their entire adult lives being the most dangerous thing in any room they entered were, for the first time, in a room where they were not the most dangerous thing. The most dangerous thing in that room was the feeling of her absence, which had arrived with the completeness and the devastation of a physical blow and had turned Minho's precision into something without a safety on it, and had turned Seo-jun's silence into a silence that his own people were very afraid of, and had turned Ji-woo, who was always the one that people underestimated, into the most focused and the most cold and the most relentless thing any of them had ever seen him be. They found her in 4 hours, not because they were lucky, because Ji-woo had spent 2 weeks quietly mapping every connection between Dae-hyun, who had left the estate too easily 3 weeks ago and had been too comfortable doing it, and the rival organization who wanted leverage over the Kang brothers. He had done it because something about Dae-hyun's departure from the garden had sat wrong with him, and Ji-woo, when something sat wrong with him, did not stop until he understood why. He understood why on the 3rd hour, and by the 4th hour, they had the location. Minho went in first. This was not planned. It was simply what happened, his body moving through the door before the signal, before the coordinated entry, because Nadia was on the other side of it, and the distance between him and her had become, at some point between the kitchen argument and this morning, completely intolerable. She heard the door and stood up. He came through it and stopped. They looked at each other across the length of the room, and the silence between them was not like any of the silences in the estate. It was not comfortable or full or charged with the held-back things of 4 careful weeks. It was the silence of 2 people who have both just realized in the same moment something they cannot unknow. She was fine. She said so immediately. She was fine. She had not been harmed. She had been very controlled about it. She was fine. He crossed the room and stood in front of her and looked at her face with the specific, total attention of someone who is running their own assessment and will not accept someone else's. And then he put his hand very carefully on the side of her face and tipped her head slightly toward the window light and looked. She let him. Her heart was doing the thing she had told it to stop doing. It had apparently not listened. Seo-jun and Ji-woo came through the door behind him. Ji-woo said her name and she turned to look at him, and his expression was, finally and completely, everything that had been underneath the surface of him for 4 weeks, uncovered, unhidden, legible. He looked at her the way people look at things they had believed. For a few terrible hours, they had lost. She said his name. He exhaled. Seo-jun stood just inside the door and looked at her and said nothing, and she had learned by now that Seo-jun's silences were not empty, and this one was the fullest silence she had ever been in the room with. She said she really was all right. Seo-jun said he knew. He said she had been counting the sounds outside the door. that she had not allowed herself to panic. He could see it in the way she was standing. And that was, he said in his quiet and impossible voice, the most terrifying and the most remarkable thing he had ever seen anyone do. She did not say anything to that. She did not trust herself to. Minho's hand was still against her face. He had not moved it. She had not moved away from it. They were both pretending not to notice this. They brought her home. The estate received them in silence. It was past midnight when the cars came through the gate, and the house was lit from within the way it never usually was, every lamp on, every corridor visible, as if the building itself had been waiting with its eyes open. Nadia stepped out of the car and looked up at it and felt something she had not expected, which was the specific feeling of coming home to a place you had not planned to call home and finding that your body had made the decision without consulting you. Minho walked beside her to the entrance. Seo Jun was on her other side. Jiwoo came through the main door ahead of them and turned on the kitchen light and put the kettle on with the focused, deliberate movements of someone who needs to do something with their hands. She sat at the kitchen counter and let Jiwoo put a mug in front of her and let Minho stand near the window with his arms crossed and let Seo Jun sit on the opposite side of the counter and look at her in that complete and total way of his, and she thought, "This is the most seen I have ever been in a room." She thought, "I do not know what to do with that." They did not talk about what had happened. Not that night. They sat in the kitchen until the tea was gone, and then Jiwoo said she should sleep, and Minho said the staff room was not good enough, and Seo Jun said nothing, but stood up and walked toward the east corridor and stopped and looked back at her, which was, she had learned, his version of a direction. She followed him. He brought her to a guest room she had cleaned but never entered from the inside, a room with a proper bed and thick curtains and the smell of cedar. And he stood in the doorway and said there were clothes in the wardrobe from the previous occasion. They had a female guest, his cousin. She could use whatever she needed. She said thank you. He looked at her for a moment, that long, unreadable look, and then he said her name very quietly, just her name, nothing attached to it. And she looked at him, and he looked back, and then he pulled the door closed. She stood in the center of the room and pressed both hands flat against her sternum, and felt her heart doing the thing it had been doing since the moment Minho's hand had come up to her face in that locked room, and she thought very clearly that she was in significant trouble. She slept for 10 hours, which she had not done since she was a child. In the morning, everything was different, and also exactly the same, which was the most disorienting way for things to be. She came into the kitchen, and all three of them were there again, which was becoming a pattern. And Jiwoo poured her coffee without being asked and set it at the specific spot at the counter she always stood at, and the coffee was the brand from the cabinet, her brand. The one Minho had sourced specifically, and she stood with the mug in her hands and looked at the three of them and thought, "What am I going to do with all of you?" She did not say this aloud. She said good morning. They said good morning. The day began. But something had shifted in the load-bearing structure of the estate's atmosphere, the same way a building shifts after a significant pressure event, still standing, all the same materials, but the alignment different, the weight distributed differently, certain things now carrying more than they had been designed to carry. She felt it in the way Minho looked at her across rooms, in the way Seo Jun had moved from standing near her to standing beside her, a specific recalibration of distance that he seemed to have made a deliberate decision about and was not negotiating. In the way Jiwoo had started talking to her in the evenings, real conversations, unhurried, about the books on the shelf and her mother in Lagos, and the way she had decided to come to Korea, and why, listening with the complete attention she had noticed in all three of them, but that Jiwoo wore most openly. She was aware of all of it. She had stopped pretending she was not. The question she was sitting with, the one that followed her through the rooms of the estate like a very patient shadow, was what any of it meant in the long term. She was staff. She had a contract. She had a mother who needed her remittances and a cousin who needed the stability Nadia's income provided, and a life that had been constructed very carefully around practicality and the understanding that certain things were not for her, not because she did not deserve them, but because the architecture of her life did not have room for them. 3 men who ran one of the most powerful criminal organizations in Korea were not in the architecture of her life. She told herself this on a Thursday evening while she was in the library, and Ji-woo was sitting in the chair by the window reading with his feet up and the lamp making a warm circle around him. And he looked up at her over the top of the book and said, "What are you thinking about?" She said nothing. He said she was frowning at the carpet. She said the carpet was fine. He said she was frowning at something in the direction of the carpet. She looked at him. He looked back with that manufactured innocence. She said she was thinking about her contract renewal. He lowered the book. He said the contract was not something she needed to think about. She said everyone needed to think about their employment status. He said her employment status was not in question. She said that was not her point. He said what was her point? She said she was thinking about whether this situation was sustainable. He set the book down entirely. He asked which situation. She said she thought he knew which situation. He looked at her for a long moment and then said he thought she should talk to Minho about that. She said she thought that would be a conversation she needed to have eventually. He said maybe sooner than eventually. She said maybe. He picked up his book again, but he was not reading it. She did not have the conversation with Minho that evening. She had it on Saturday, which was not planned, which arrived the way significant conversations always arrive, on the back of something smaller that opened a door that had been closed. She was in the kitchen making her mother's ground nut soup, which she made when she was working through something difficult, because the process of it required attention and repetition and had the specific soothing quality of things the body learned before the mind was old enough to be complicated. Minho came in and stopped when he smelled it and said something she did not catch, and she asked him to repeat it. He said his mother used to cook something that smelled like that. Not the same dish, but the same kind of smell, the one that meant someone was in the kitchen putting care into something. She looked at him. He was looking at the pot. He said his mother had died when they were 17. She said she was sorry. He said it was a long time ago. She said time didn't always make that kind of thing smaller. He looked at her then, the full look, the one without the professional distance on it, and he said no, it didn't. They stood in the kitchen with the soup on the stove between them and the evening coming down outside the window, and she thought, this is the moment. This is where I say the thing I have been not saying for 4 weeks. She said, I need to tell you something. He said, all right. She said she was aware that the circumstances of the last month had created something between the 4 of them that was not strictly professional, that she had feelings she had not planned to have, and that were not appropriate given the nature of their arrangement, and that she thought it was important to name that clearly so that they could both make decisions with accurate information. She said this very steadily and without looking away from him, because she had decided that if she was going to say it, she was going to say it properly. Minho did not say anything for a moment. Then he said, with the same precision he applied to everything, that he appreciated her naming it. She said she was glad. He said he wanted to respond in kind. She said all right. He said that he and his brothers had been having a version of this conversation for 3 weeks, meaning among themselves, and that the conclusion they had reached was not simple, and was not something he was going to pretend was simple. He said she was not staff to them, had not been for some time, and that the arrangement they were currently in was a fiction they had been maintaining for reasons that were primarily about not frightening her. She looked at him. He said he knew how that sounded. She said she was not frightened of them. He said he knew that too. He said that was one of the things. He stopped. He looked at the pot and then at her and said there were several things, actually, and that he was not accustomed to saying things like this, and he was aware he was doing it badly. She said he was not doing it badly. He looked at her. She said he was doing it exactly as well as the situation required. Something moved in his face, unguarded, real, the thing she had been catching glimpses of for 4 weeks suddenly in the open. He said her name, just her name, the same way Seo-jun had said it through the door of the guest room. Like it was the whole sentence. She said she needed time to think. He said he understood. She said she was not running. He said he knew. She said she had a complicated life outside this estate. He said he knew that too, and he was not asking her to simplify it, he was asking her to let him be part of it. She looked at the pot, and then at him, and then at the pot, and said she would think about it. She thought about it. She thought about it while Seo-jun walked beside her through the garden on Sunday morning in a silence that was the most articulate silence she had ever been in. She thought about it while Ji-woo sat across from her at the kitchen table on Monday evening and told her about the first book that had made him feel understood, which turned out to be a Nigerian novel she had read at 14, and the look on his face when she said she knew it, the incandescent surprise and pleasure of it. She thought about it while Minho brought her tea she had not asked for on Tuesday afternoon and set it on the desk beside her without interrupting what she was doing and left the room. She thought about it, and at the end of the thinking she found that the answer had been in her body for weeks, and her mind was only now catching up to it. She found all three of them in the study on Wednesday evening, which was unusual. They were not in a meeting. They were simply there, in the same room, Minho at the desk, Seo-jun by the window, Ji-woo on the couch with a book he was not reading, and the scene had the quality of three people who have been waiting for something and are not admitting to waiting. She stood in the doorway and they all looked at her and she thought, well, she thought, all right then. She said she had been thinking about what Minho had said in the kitchen. Minho said yes. She said she had some questions. Seo-jun said ask them. She said she was not someone who would be managed. All three of them were very still. She said she meant that if this was going to be a real thing and not a polite fiction, she needed to be a person who was told the truth and consulted and treated as someone with her own agency and her own life that did not disappear into the orbit of their estate. She said she loved her work, and she was good at it, and she was not going to vanish into someone else's story. She said those were not negotiable. Minho said those terms were acceptable. Seo-jun said they were more than acceptable. Ji-woo said he thought she should know he had been the one to put the books in her room. He had been waiting for the right moment to say that, and this seemed like the right moment. She looked at him. He looked back steadily. She said she had figured that. He said he thought she might have. The silence that followed was the warmest silence the estate had ever held. The weeks that followed were a kind of becoming. It was not dramatic. It was the slow, cellular thing that happens when two people, or in this particular case, 4 people, stop performing distance and start living in the actual space. She moved her things to the guest room by mutual agreement, and then by unanimous agreement, the guest room became her room. And no one used the word permanent out loud, but the word was there in the reorganization of the wardrobe and the way her preferred coffee migrated from the back of the cabinet to the front. She called her mother on a Sunday, and her mother asked how she was, and she said she was well, and her mother was quiet for a moment and said she sounded different and asked what had changed. Nadia thought about the kitchen and the garden, and 3 men who fell over themselves to be at the gate at 7:15 in the morning. She said things were good. Her mother said she was glad. She still had her contract and still took her work seriously, and still told Minho when his scheduling was unreasonable, which it periodically still was, and Minho still had to actively resist his instinct to manage things in her direction without consulting her, and Seo-jun was still fundamentally incapable of not placing himself between her and anything that might be a threat, and Ji-woo still asked 3 practical questions before the real question, and then looked away when he got the answer as if the answer had startled him, even when it hadn't. None of that changed. All of it became the texture of the life she was living inside this estate, familiar and specific and entirely her own. The danger came back in the spring. It came back because danger in their world did not close its account, simply because it had been repaid once. The rival organization had not dissolved, it had recalculated, and the recalculation had produced a different strategy. One that targeted not the estate or the brothers or their operations, but the thing that all 3 of them had made visible in the month since October, which was that she mattered to them in a way that nothing had ever mattered before. This time she was not taken. This time the threat arrived in the form of an ultimatum delivered to Minho, a demand that the Kang organization cede territory in exchange for a guarantee of her safety, and the specific genius of it as a threat was that it was not about taking something from them, but about making them choose between two things they would not choose between. Min-ho did not make the choice. He rejected the premise of the ultimatum entirely. What he did instead was tell her everything. He sat across from her at the kitchen table on a Tuesday evening, all three of them, and told her the full shape of the threat. He told her who the organization was, what they wanted, what the current risk assessment was, and what their response to it would be. He did not soften it. He did not manage the information. He gave it to her complete and trusted her to be a person who could receive it complete. She was quiet for a long time when he finished. Then she said she had a question. He said, "Ask it." She said, "Did they tell you to give up territory for me?" He said, "Yes." She said, "And you said no." He said they said no, all three of us, without discussing it because there was nothing to discuss. She looked at him, and then at Seo-jun, and then at Ji-woo. She said, "You are going to bring me into your world more fully than I have been, and you are going to need to do that honestly, with my knowledge, because I will not be protected without being informed." Min-ho said that was exactly the conversation he had wanted to have. She said, "Good, then let's have it." They did. They had it that night, and it was the most honest conversation the estate had ever contained. All of it. The shape of what they were. The shape of what she was entering. The things she would see and the things she would be asked to understand and the things she had already survived, herself in her life, before she ever arrived at their gate. All of it on the table. All of it received. While they were still discussing, the air in the room tightened, and she noticed the three brothers circling around her, and she knew what it meant. She could feel the heat. "Nadia, let us have you for one night, please," Min-ho started as they traced their fingers all over her body. She tried so hard to resist their touch, but she wanted it as much. "I can't. I'm a veer," she tried to say, but Ji-woo cut her off. "We know," he said, "but we promised to go easy on you," he continued in a hush voice, placing her hands in between his third legs. "Can't you see what you do to us?" Seo-jun said, placing her other hand in between his. Nadia could feel how hardened they were, and her body spiked up, yearning for more. Min-ho claimed her lips with a deep kiss, and she gave in to them as they caressed and worshipped her body like a goddess. They took turns having her innocence as her screams for pleasure echoed loudly, turning them on. They had her all night till the early morning when she passed out of exhaustion, but she enjoyed every bit of it and wanted even more. By morning, she was woken up with kisses from three of them, and she covered her face shyly. "Don't be shy now," they chorused. "You are the best thing we've ever tasted," Seo-jun whispered. Later that day, she made food for them all, but she couldn't get the memories of last night out of her head as she kept smiling sheepishly. She thought her first would be with one man, but she never imagined having three inside of her. By the time the rival organization moved, the Kang network had already closed around her with a completeness that left no gap. Not as a prisoner, not as a trophy, as someone who was simply, absolutely, unambiguously part of their life. She knew the people. She knew the routes. She knew the protocols and had contributed to several of them with the same practical, unsentimental precision she brought to cleaning the kitchen and reorganizing the library. The rival organization was neutralized over the course of 3 weeks by a strategy that Ji-woo had designed, and that was so thorough and so quiet that it had resolved itself before most people realized it had begun. No violence that reached the estate, no danger that reached her. Min-ho told her it was over on a Wednesday morning at the kitchen counter. She said good. She poured him coffee. He caught her wrist as she set the pot down, not hard, just present, a contact with weight and intention in it. She looked at his hand and then at his face. He said her name. She said she knew. He said he wanted to say it properly. She said she was listening. He said that in 32 years of building walls that worked, he had never once had a conversation through one of them that mattered, and that she had demolished every single wall he had without appearing to try, and that he did not have the right architecture for what he felt, but he was going to spend whatever time she gave him learning it. She looked at him for a moment. She said that was quite a thing to say in a kitchen on a Wednesday morning. He said he had been waiting for the right moment, and had decided there was no right moment, and a Wednesday morning was as good as anything else. She said he was not wrong about that. He said he loved her. He said it the way he said everything, precisely, with no excess around it, and it landed exactly the way precise things land, without room for misinterpretation. She said she loved him too. She said all three of you because that was also true, and Minho looked at her with that undone expression and said he knew that too, and said that what they were building was not a thing with a standard name, and the absence of a standard name did not make it less real. She said she knew that. She said she had known it since approximately the 3rd week of October. He said that was before the kitchen argument. She said yes. He said she had known since before she told him off about the meeting schedule. She said she had chosen to tell him off anyway because she was not going to be silent about her own life regardless of how she felt. He said that was one of the things. She said she knew. Seo Jun proposed first. This was not planned, or perhaps it was, in the way that Seo Jun planned everything that he never discussed planning. He did it in the garden, in the spring, on a morning when the light was coming in low over the east wall and she was standing near the roses she had been tending since October. And he walked out and stood beside her and was quiet for a moment, and then said he had something to ask. She said all right. He said he was not a man who had long speeches in him, and he was not going to perform a speech at her, and she would not want him to. She said she agreed. He said what he had was a life that was complicated and permanent, and hers if she wanted it. He said he was asking her to stay, not as a detail of his life, but as the center of it, all three of them, the only center they had agreed on. He opened his hand and there was a ring in it that was simple and significant, and clearly chosen with the knowledge of exactly who she was. She looked at it for a moment and then at him, and then she took his face in her hands the way he had done to her in the locked room, and she kissed him, and he made a sound that was very quiet and very complete, and she understood that Seo Jun's version of everything was quiet and complete, and that was the language of him, and she was fluent in it now. Minho and Jiwoo were at the kitchen window. Jiwoo was looking at his shoes. Minho was not pretending to be doing anything else. When she came back inside, Seo Jun behind her, Jiwoo looked up and said, in his best imitation of someone who had not been watching, that he had a question. She said she thought he might. He said he had been working on a speech. She said she knew. She had seen him working on it on Tuesday. He said it was not finished. She said she did not need it to be finished. He said it was mostly about the books and the soup and the fact that being her favorite person in a room had turned out to be the only distinction he had ever truly wanted, and that he intended to be it for the rest of his life. She said that was a very good speech for an unfinished one. He said he had not even got to the part about the ring. She said she gathered there was a ring. He said there was definitely a ring, and he took it out of his pocket, and she looked at it and then at him and said yes. And he looked, finally, like someone who had stopped pretending he was not waiting for something and had received it. Minho waited. He waited for 3 weeks, and then one evening when it was just the two of them in the kitchen, and the house was quiet around them, and the soul night was coming in through the window in the particular way it did in May, warm and full of the city living, he stood across from her and said he had been thinking about what to say for 6 months and had decided on something very simple. She said, all right. He said he had built everything he had by knowing what mattered and protecting it with everything he was, and she was what mattered, and he was asking if he could spend the rest of his life doing that. She crossed the kitchen and stood in front of him and said she was not someone who needed to be protected so much as someone who wanted to be known. He said he knew the difference. She said she knew he did. He put the ring on her finger himself, carefully, with both hands, looking at it and then at her. She looked back at him with the steadiness she had walked into his estate with on a Tuesday in October, and that had not shifted once. That had always been exactly what it was, herself, completely, seeing them completely, choosing this completely. They married in the spring of the following year, a ceremony that was small and specific, and nothing like what the world expected of the Kang brothers, which was exactly right. Her mother came from Lagos and cried from the moment she arrived to the moment she left and said, in Nadia's ear at the reception, that she had always known her daughter was going to change someone's world. Nadia said quietly, "Mama, I think it was the other way around. Her mother said it was probably both." The estate changed around them in the way that houses change when they are actually lived in. It was louder, it was warmer. It had plants that Nadia kept alive and books that moved from room to room and a kitchen that smelled every evening like something that mattered. Jiwoo found her reading in the library on an evening in the autumn when the light was the gold kind, and he sat in the chair across from her and looked at her with the particular expression she had learned to read perfectly, the one that was underneath all the practical questions, and said he had something to tell her. She put the book down. He said she was going to be a mother. He said it the way he said important things directly, without the excess around it, and his face had on it the particular undone quality that all three of them had worn, at one time or another, in moments that mattered beyond what they knew how to say. She was very still for a moment. Then she pressed one hand flat against her stomach and looked at him and said, "Are you certain?" He said he was certain. She looked at the ceiling and breathed. He waited because that was one of the things about Jiwoo he had learned to wait for her. She said she needed a moment. He said, "Take all the time you need." She took a moment, and then she said quietly, "I'm going to need a bigger shelf." He looked at her. She said, "The one in the library for the children's books. I am going to need a bigger shelf." He looked at her for a second, and then he made a sound that was not his usual controlled self at all, warm and surprised and completely genuine. And he crossed the room and sat on the arm of her chair and put his arm around her, and she leaned into him, and they stayed like that with the autumn light coming in until Minho's voice came from down the hall asking where everyone was. She called back from the library. He appeared in the doorway. He looked at the two of them and at her face, and he went very still, and she watched him understand. He crossed the room in 3 steps and crouched in front of her, and took both her hands and looked at her. And she nodded, and he pressed her hands to his forehead and closed his eyes, and was very quiet for a moment, in the way of a man receiving something he had not known he was allowed to want. "Seo Jun," she told in the garden. She waited until he appeared beside her the next morning in the way that he always did, quiet and present, taking up the space beside her as if he had been designed specifically for that geometry. And she turned to him and said she had news. He looked at her. She said it. He looked at her face, and then at her hands, and then at the garden, and then back at her. And the expression on his face was the same one he had worn in the locked room when he had crossed to her and put his hand against her face and asked if she was all right. Stripped bare, unmanaged, everything that lived below the surface of him in full view, and he said, in his quiet and complete way, that he was glad. She said she knew. He said he was very glad. She said she knew that too. He put his arm around her, and they stood in the garden that she had tended back to life from weeds, and the morning came in around them, and the estate was warm and full and real and entirely, completely home. She had arrived at their gate with a tote bag and a professional reference, and absolutely no intention of changing anyone's life. She had stayed because she was good at her work, and because the pay was fair, and because deleting a number from a contact list felt like a different kind of loss than she was ready for. She had stayed, and then she had chosen to stay, and then choosing to stay had become the shape of her entire life, the best shape it had ever had, built on the only foundation she had ever trusted completely, which was the one where she was seen fully and chosen anyway. The estate was never quiet again after that. It was full of the specific sound of people who have chosen each other past the point of return. Her mother visited in the summers. Her cousin came for the new year. Jiwoo's books expanded to 3 shelves. Seo Jun's garden surveillance extended to a perimeter that would have been excessive if it was not in service of something so completely worth it. Minho started eating sitting down. She still told him when his scheduling was unreasonable. He still needed to hear it. Some things, the important ones, do not change. Some things do. The morning she brought their daughter home, all 3 of them were at the door, which was not a gate this time, it was a threshold, and they were not waiting for a housekeeper who did not know she was about to change everything. They were waiting for the woman who had already changed everything, who was carrying the specific, impossible proof of it in her arms, and the child looked at the three of them over her mother's shoulder with dark, wide eyes and the particular expression of someone who has arrived exactly where they are supposed to be. Nadia stood in the entrance of the estate and looked at the three men who had tried, very briefly and very badly, to make her a prop in someone else's story, and who had become, instead, the whole story themselves. And she thought about that Tuesday in October and the gate and the mold behind the kitchen cabinet and the way it had all started with something so small and practical and had arrived here, at this morning, at this threshold, at this life that was larger and fuller and more herself than any life she had ever imagined for herself in all the years before it. She stepped inside. They closed the door.